Hello, everyone. And today we're going to be interviewing an eminent statistician who is from Mumbai. He goes by the name of Sundaram, but most people know him as F1StatsGuru due to his amazing work across social media. And today, Vyas, head of writing at Project DIVEBOMB, will be interviewing Sundaram on his career so far and all things motorsport, or let's say most things motorsport. So the first question that comes to mind is like, what got you into motorsport?
That's a very interesting question because I was actually born and brought up in the Middle East in Bahrain.
Wow.
So I, being someone from a typical Indian family, was exposed to a lot of cricket back then. I didn't like cricket a lot, but my dad used to watch that. That was the only sport my dad used to watch at home. So yeah, yeah. I was exposed to a lot of cricket at the time, but I didn't really know there were so many categories in car
Uh,
racing as well, like Formula One and IndyCar and as well, all those. So somewhere around mid 2003, I was just browsing through a magazine and I came across an article about a driver who had won his first ever race in Formula One, and there was just some sort of connection with reading that article. I would have never read it, but I actually went on reading it, and the sort of appreciation that was being showered on this driver, calling him a generational talent, calling him a future world champion. I was just for some reason very I was drawn to that
yeah.
article and the driver, and that was Fernando Alonso. So who had won his first race in Formula One, the 2003 Hungarian Grand Prix.
Hungary. Yeah.
So yeah, so for some reason that day itself, I decided that this guy is going to be my favorite Formula One driver. And without even, understanding anything about the sport or without even watching a race, I had kind of already been introduced to the sport and had already decided who my favorite driver was. So that was my first brush with Formula One. And I kind of started watching the races after that. And in 2004 was when we had the first Bahrain Grand Prix, and that was
Wow.
also on a
Yeah.
date I particularly remember because it was held on 040404, the 4th of April
Oh,
2004. The Sunday coincidentally fell on that date, so there was a lot of marketing going on, lots of promotions about the inaugural Bahrain Grand Prix, lots of buzz. But to be very honest, Bahrain wasn't particularly a location or a country which had any sort of history in that sense. They preferred football, and but basically they're just building an audience there, and that also created quite a bit of hype around motorsport and Formula One. Uh, but another very interesting story is that same year I had a school project. I was in ninth grade then, and I had a school project, and I decided to do something a little bit more different from the other people. So my project was around Formula One. So I cut out a couple of clippings from the newspapers, local newspapers and magazines, and I just put it all together in a notebook, and I wrote a little about the drivers and Formula One, just some very basic details. And I went to school, and surprisingly, there was a girl in my class who was very fascinated with my project because yeah, it was pretty unique, something around Formula One. So she asked if she could look at my book, and I gave it to her, and she just went through the pages. And there was one page where there was a poster. I had stuck a poster of all the 20 drivers who were participating. I mean, there were more than 20, but in the photo there were 20. And what really surprised me was she was able to name all the 20 drivers in that poster. And what was surprising for me was, yeah, it's possible to name drivers like Michael Schumacher or Fernando Alonso or Kimi Raikkonen because those were the more popular stars at the time. But she actually took out the names of all the 20 drivers, including the likes of Giorgio Pantano, Zolt Baumgartner, and the likes. I'm like, how do you know these names? And I kind of felt a little left out. I was massively impressed that at our age she was able to name all the drivers. So I felt okay, I am missing out on something interesting over here, and I should probably read a little bit more about the sport and everything. So I spent some time reading about all the drivers and trying to understand the sport a little bit more. So that was how I actually got interested in Formula One. Thanks to my classmate, and also thanks to that magazine in 2003.
A quick follow-up question. Can you remember the name of that magazine? I would love to know.
I really can't remember. I don't know if it was a magazine which came with one of the newspapers, Khalij Times that time, but there was
Ah,
some magazine. I really don't remember what it was. It
that's
wasn't a
fine.
sports magazine. It wasn't a sports magazine, but it had one section in sports, and it
Ah,
was about Alonso's first win in Formula One.
well, about that girl, I'm sure she's an absolute legend. If they can name
No, no,
20 drivers like that,
she's one of the more keen followers of the sport. She's someone who's been, um, I mean, we have Drive to Survive and all these F1 TV right
yeah,
now, but she was someone who would collect magazines back then. She would collect end of season review videos and everything since then. So she was a staunch follower of F1 and motorsport since that time.
wow, that's amazing to hear. And I had one more, again, another important question. Like, what got you into the world of social media and what made you want to start an Instagram account about F1?
So I've always wanted to create some sort of content. I am a diehard cricket fan, so that's the number one sport for me, and that will always remain my number one sport. Formula One came after that, so I actually started creating content in 2012 around cricket, writing a few articles and everything, but that quickly shut down because I got a little bit more busy with work. And in 2015 was when I actually saw someone creating content around F1. There was this one girl by the name Chandni. I think she
Oh,
was staying in Canada, and she was very regular in putting up F1 content after literally every day of the race weekend. So I think her channel went by the name Chandni Vlogs on Formula One. Very, very knowledgeable, and from fans' perspective as well, she would take note of the very smallest things and mentioned that during her videos. And I feel that this is very good content to listen to, and even I would like to do something similar because I feel there's some sort of a perspective or an opinion in which even I would like to share to the world. So I started doing videos in 2015, YouTube videos back then, and even
huh.
I quickly realized that it's no easy game. Once you start recording videos, once you start uploading it, you kind of realize, okay, it's a lot more difficult that than you initially imagine.
Yeah,
So then again, once again, I got busy with work and stuff. Then in 2018, once I moved jobs, I found a lot more spare time to kill. So I decided that I'm going to put this into a productive space and something that I can create on my own, especially around Formula One. And I was doing a lot of listening to the Inside Line F1 podcast then. So the guys I'm actually working with right now, I was listening to them back in 2018, 2017, a fair bit. And that time we had a male host and a female host, and it was very light-hearted content but still very knowledgeable content, very connected with what the sport is all about. And that also gave me another reason. I'm like, okay, if doing videos was difficult, maybe you can try your hand on doing a podcast. So I decided later that year, okay, I'm going to start a podcast and I'm going to see how that goes, just try and share my views and opinions about Formula One. So I spent a fair bit of time figuring out how to upload my podcast episodes and all of that, which again made me realize that creating content is no mean feat. It's a lot more easier to say that you can create content, but once you're doing it is when you realize how much effort goes behind it. So I started a podcast eventually, and but then I'm like, okay, how do people know that I've put out new episodes? So I need to start an Instagram page. So then my Instagram page started with the sole intention of just promoting my podcasts. And then again, it dawned upon me like, okay, apart from episodes, what else do you have to offer? Obviously, you have to have an active Instagram page. So then I started doing news through 2018 and 2019. So a lot of different experimentations, but eventually, yeah, I actually started off as a news page in 2019 onwards.
that is brilliant to hear. I mean, and I absolutely second what you said. It's very easy to say, yeah, let me become a content creator, but sustaining that is just the hardest bit. And of course, being a cricket fan, I can relate when you said I started writing articles, but it wasn't really the best thing. It's very hard to stand out in that world.
No, exactly. And the fact that there is so much of cricket ongoing, at this point of time that it's sometimes even difficult to follow as a fan, because there's just so much of cricket being played
Yeah,
across different leagues and different one days. I mean, India is playing two different series at literally the same time or a week apart. So there's just too much cricket happening, and it
yeah,
would have been, like you mentioned, it would have been very difficult to stand out. So I kind of went to the next best thing, which I liked, which is Formula One, a very niche sport in a way,
true.
but still it did not have the sort of creators like literally 7 8 years ago.
Yeah, and even today you can say Formula One is a bit of a niche in India, still growing.
No, absolutely. It's a niche in India, but uh, thanks to probably Drive to Survive or the sort of buzz that 2021 created the season,
Yeah,
and just the fact that people had a little bit more time to spare during COVID. So there's increasing popularity about Formula One in India. A lot of people are curious about what the sport is. A lot of people are, through word of mouth, getting to know about the sport. And I have to say this, there are some incredible creators in India. And to be very honest, I don't think so. There are creators anywhere else the sort of caliber that Indian creators have, and I'm not kidding. A lot of creators. There are some incredible creators that we have across different genres. I'm primarily just someone into statistics and the likes, but we have some amazing creators in India, which I've not seen anywhere else.
true. I second your point. I've since ever since the COVID pandemic, I've seen a lot of F1 fan pages from India pop up, and it's amazing to see the receptiveness our sport is getting, our favorite
I mean,
sport.
there are quite a few Indian pages that have over 50K, over 100K. So there definitely is a sort of audience that would like to know a little bit more about Formula One. I mean, it can be a meme page, it can be a fun page, it can be anything else. But there is a lot of interest about Formula One in India, and that's great to see, and that also works well for creators like us.
Exactly. True that. I mean, I just love the influx of F1 content on my Instagram feed.
Absolutely,
Absolutely makes my day.
it's
So,
great.
yeah, and the next question I had to you is what challenges did you face when you started your account and how did you overcome them?
I think for any creator who wants to create content, but if they don't really understand how the platform works, and it's difficult to understand how the platform works initially, at least unless you're a professional in that particular domain. You understand how social media works and what are the tips and tricks that are needed to kind of succeed in that. But if you're just like anyone who wants to create content, it's the sort of validation that we kind of seek immediately is first major challenge, because I know a lot of people DM me, a lot of creators DM me saying that my page isn't growing and people aren't seeing my content. And that's basically the same sort of challenges I faced as well, because from a creator's point of view, we are creating great work and we want people to like it. We want people to comment. I know the amount of times I've spent putting out a post and then just waiting for someone to like it or waiting for someone to comment on it. Those days are always there, but the fact is that it's important that you keep creating content so that people are able to relate to your work. And it's also important to understand that you might not be putting out the best content straight away. So it's very, very important to fine tune, experiment what works. And that's basically what happened with me. So, like I said, I started off as a news page in 2019. And through 2019, 2020, I was doing only news. Any sort of news that would come out, I would spend a couple of minutes just taking in all the news and then putting it out in my own words, putting a photo and informing people of what it was. So that's basically how my journey started. And that had a slow growth, I would say. I think I had hit 5,000 followers somewhere only in November 2021. So and I kind of realized somewhere in 2021 that yeah, sure, you have different sources of news. How do you stand out from this crowd? And that's when I was doing a lot of experimentation with different types of storytelling, with different types of quotes, with news. It wasn't only news. So I was doing a lot of things, and I also started doing stats. I never really realized that I loved stats, but then I had a certain inclination towards numbers in general, and it probably arose from my interest for cricket fantasy. I used to play a lot of fantasy cricket with my friends in the mid 2010s, and just that whole competitive mindset of trying to beat my colleagues or friends. I used to spend a lot of time looking at cricket records and cricket stats and trying to find patterns out of all of them. So it kind of came from that. And I started doing F1 stats posts as well somewhere in 2021. And I kind of realized that people like stats posts more than the other type of content I do. So I realized somewhere that time is maybe like, okay, it'll also be a little bit more convenient for me to do stats related content. And in September 2021 is when I actually went completely to a stats only page. So it's very important that although you want that sort of validation, it's very important that you give it a little bit of time on your social media journey as a creator in general, because obviously within a week, within a month, you might not see results. If you're already that good, if your content is that great, sure, it'll go viral straight away. But it's very, very important to kind of have a little belief in what you've set out to do. It's important to be consistent. I wasn't consistent at all in 2019. There were days where I would tell myself, yeah, it's been 2 weeks since you've put up some content. Maybe you should put up something today. But I really didn't feel the sort of connect with my content then. But uh, during COVID, I really felt very passionate about what I was doing, and I could wake up every day thinking that, okay, today I'm going to do this, tomorrow I'm going to do that. So I felt that connect, I felt the passion towards what I was doing, and it's also very important to analyze what your audience likes. It's also very important to fine tune things to what they prefer and what's working well. So a little bit of all of these. So and these things are a constant story even right now. So even if my page is slightly bigger than what it used to be right now, it's important to understand the trends and see what do people like. It's very, very important to adapt to all the new things that are coming on each type of platform, and it's very important to treat every audience differently. So your Instagram audience is not your Twitter audience. Your Twitter audience is not your YouTube audience. So you need to make tailor-made content specifically for each of that audience. And yeah, I think you'll do well.
Exactly. I totally agree with the last point you said. Instagram audience is not your Twitter audience. It's you have to curate content which is specific to such apps. And it's
Absolutely.
something I'm totally understanding while at DIVEBOMB. We are facing that sort of move up. So my next question to you would be, so basically I've heard about you and the fact that you've received plenty of acclaim from broadcasters, drivers, and all that for your esteemed work in the field of statistics. So, what would you like to say about that?
It's only gratifying, to be very honest, and I have still not been uh, used to seeing my work being shared by drivers or being mentioned on the broadcast. Every time it pops up and I'm just jumping around like a little kid, just like how excited I was the very first time it happened, because it's great to see it being mentioned time and time again. And unless I'm F1's official statistician, which I hope to be one fine day, I will it'll always be the same for me. The sort of reception and the sort of ultimately it's just I'm just grateful that I'm only a creator. I'm not in any way associated with Formula One. So if they feel that my work is worth resharing or mentioning on the broadcast, then they see value in it, which only gives me more motivation to keep doing this.
That's absolutely great to hear. I mean, it definitely caught my eye when I saw your stats too, because I follow your page, one of your many, I don't know how many K followers. It's really grown, that number of followers.
Thank you.
And my next question to you is it's a pretty crazy one, this question. What is the craziest stat you've made ever?
That would probably be the one that I got around the 2022 French Grand Prix. So I've actually kind of kind of realized this as a content creator, that the type of stats that I spent a lot of time researching, and verifying and creating, those sort of stats don't receive the sort of attention or feedback like I intend to. Because if I've spent hours and hours finding that stat, I really expect that stat to blow up, and that's not been the case. The stats that are more simply represented or simply depicted in graphics, they are the sort of stats that more, the ones that are more easier to consume. Those are the sort of stats that generally tend to do well. So I think the craziest stat for me, or my biggest stat in that sense, would be the fact that no driver has won a race after their 300th Grand Prix. Because I've found quite a few stats. I've found quite a few patterns. I'm a sucker for patterns, and any sort of pattern that I've found off lately has been broken, and that too in a very terrible way by Max Verstappen. So Verstappen fans always know this. Any type of pattern that I can come up with, he is absolutely smashing it in the next race. But that is the stat that I mentioned is only one that still continues. So that was, I think, the Wednesday night ahead of the race weekend. I think it was well past midnight, at around 1 o'clock or something, is when I realized that yeah, it's going to be Lewis Hamilton's 300th race in Formula One, and he was
Uh,
in this. I mean, okay, so 2021 was before that, yeah. So he had not won any race up until then, and I just had to figure if a driver had ever won a race after the 300th race. And I went back to all the records. I went back to Schumi, Raikkonen, Button, Barrichello, and coincidentally, none of them had won a race after the 300th race. I mean, surely they were all into the latter stages of their career. So obviously, they were not in the quickest of eras. Uh, but it seemed like Hamilton was most likely set to break it. But I just found that very interesting. And whenever I think I've found a very good stat, there's just some sort of energy that comes within me. I'm like, okay, I really have to put this out. And I put this out at around 2 o'clock in the morning, and I went to sleep, and it had blown up quite a fair bit uh, by the morning. And the funny part of that stat was I had put up all the drivers' images who had finished 300 races, and under Alonso I put a zero, and under Hamilton I put a question mark. So there were quite a few people asking
ah,
me, why is there no question mark around Alonso? And I very honestly responded that because it doesn't seem like he's going to be in a front running car. And people, although did agree with it, so roughly 6 or 7 months later, he was very much close to winning a race this year. He
yeah,
almost won a race in
oh,
Monaco,
good.
and I always thought that Hamilton would be breaking that record, and it came that close to being broken by Fernando Alonso. But yeah, that stat did very well, because on Thursday itself, that was the very first question that was being asked from the floor. David Croft picked it up, and he asked Lewis Hamilton about that straight away in the Thursday press conference, and he even mentioned Alonso, who was there in that press conference. It was mentioned in the pre-race weekend warm-up, which had Rosanna Tennant and Will Buxton on it. It was mentioned quite a few times through that whole race weekend. So there was a lot of interest around that stat, and it continued to be mentioned quite a few times through the season, and it's still not broken. So I know whenever someone breaks it, whenever Hamilton or Alonso eventually win, I know that's going to be my stat that goes up. But I think it will be broken at some point of time, maybe this year, maybe next year. But yeah, it will be broken.
One eye on you, Lewis. You can
Sorry.
surely break it. One eye on you, Lewis. That's kind of what I'm saying, looking at Lewis
Yeah,
Hamilton.
yeah.
I
Yes, yes,
believe he can
absolutely.
break it. It's very much possible.
It's very much possible that he'll break it.
And
I'm
of
only
course,
surprised that he's not already broken it.
yeah, me too. But that day will come. He will definitely win.
Yes, it will.
And as for Fernando, of course, when you were mentioning Monaco, me in my heart, I'm like, oh, so nice. It was so good. The few moments he was on pole, and I was like, okay, this is going to be a big day. But unfortunately, I'm sure he'll get his 33rd, the much anticipated 33rd win.
I'm
Yeah,
hoping for that. I'm,
if
I'm,
he
I'm
was
waiting for that. I'm waiting for number 33.
certainly right. So that's one question, of course, I had. And now we come to, let's say, a burning question. This is one I'm willing to ask any Indian. What steps do you think India should take, or Indian Motorsport Council should take to improve India's motorsport presence?
Um, I think there are a lot of factors for that to happen, and I'll give you an example of what I experienced as someone who was staying in Bahrain. And like I mentioned earlier, Bahrain was not a country where there was a lot of motorsport history. All people had heard about was football or probably a few other sports. So what they did in Bahrain is they actually built an audience from the ground up, and for that to happen, a lot of things have to work. So what they did is they picked up the audience pretty early, and they ensured that the race stays on the calendar for a long enough time so that people eventually over 6 7 years start developing an interest towards the race. So probably it was feasible for a country like Bahrain to invest a set amount of money year on year. I mean, millions of money, millions of dollars, obviously, but they kind of believed in the idea that we can eventually cultivate an audience out of these people if we do it long enough. And that's basically what they did to a country that probably did not have any understanding of what modes. I mean, it was the first country in the Middle East to start off with the Formula One race. It wasn't even the UAE, it wasn't Saudi Arabia, it wasn't any of the other bigger countries. Bahrain is actually one of the smaller countries in the Middle East, but they put in the money into it. And to be very honest, I felt the first 7 8 races that happened in Bahrain were not the most interesting races that we saw in Bahrain. I always felt that the Bahrain circuit was very boring in that sense, but something really turned around when 2014 onwards, which was actually the 10th race in Bahrain. They shifted to a night race, and ever since then we've
Yeah.
had amazing, extremely thrilling races in Bahrain for some reason. And the reason to support that is because I have a lot of friends in Bahrain, and they would only buy the tickets for the Bahrain Grand Prix to attend the concerts that would be held later or before the race. You have different rock stars and pop
Uh,
stars performing during the race weekend, and they would buy the tickets only because they would like to attend the concerts. And attending the race was just some sort of supplementary thing that they did, yeah, sure, along the side. So there was no general interest towards motorsport. But in the last 10 years, I've seen a lot of my friends being converted into Formula One fans, just because of how Formula One as an event has been happening there year on year. So this is the sort of example that I wanted to say, that it's important if India wants to generate a sort of Formula One audience. It is important that we have the race on the calendar for a long enough duration. And there are a lot of other things that are important. First and foremost, we need a broadcaster. We don't have a broadcaster, unfortunately, and probably there are reasons as to why that's not happening. So sure, we know a lot of Indians want to watch Formula One. We know a lot of people complaining about F1 TV and how expensive it is, but you really have to think about it from their perspective as well. Is there not that big enough an audience in India which can also make a profit for them? So it also has to be financially viable for them.
yeah.
So is there not much of demand that any broadcaster raises their hand and says, okay, I am going to broadcast Formula One in India, even if it's for a nominal charge or whatever it is. I'm really surprised that there is no F1 broadcast at this point of time. So when you have demand, you have an F1 broadcast, and when you have an F1 broadcast, you probably have sponsors. They put in the money into the sport, and then so that's just one side of the thing. But you also need to ensure that the race stays on the calendar for a good 6 7 years for you to start building that audience. You need to have communities, you need to have the sort of education about the sport as well. So although we have Formula E coming to India, although we have MotoGP coming to India, unfortunately India is not there on the Formula E calendar next year. So just one event doesn't do it. And I know when I went to the Formula E race in Hyderabad, there was still a lot of questions about what is this format, how is it different from Formula One. So it takes time for those questions to be answered. It takes time for people to kind of warm up to a different kind of motorsport category. So it's never a 2 year plan or a 3 year plan. And unfortunately, whenever the Indian Grand Prix was held, I think it was held at a very good time. But the fact is that the sort of numbers that in terms of attendance that was happening, it was declining. So it's great to just launch something, but it's very, very important that it sustains. So Formula One then one kind of went into a decline uh, towards 2015, 2016, especially when you have circuits like the German Grand Prix dropping from the calendar only because it wasn't financially feasible for them, or even the Malaysian Grand Prix dropping off the calendar. With the introduction of Drive to Survive and all of this, there's a lot of interest, but it'll only happen in India if a promoter or an organizer can firstly do it well, can sustain it, and secondly if they can generate a profit, or if it seems financially sensible for them. But that's just Formula One, if that's the question. But in general around motorsport, I think there's a lot of buzz being created around Indian motorsport in general, and I'm very glad that we have creators in India who are focusing not only on Formula One, but also focusing on the lower levels of motorsport, down from karting to all the other championships that happen in India on two wheels or even four wheels. So I'm glad that there are creators focusing and sharing those stories to the rest of the Indian population as well. So that is something that has to continue. A general interest has to be there, a general appreciation has to be there to all the drivers in go karting or even in bikes, and they should have adequate sort of sponsorships as well. I know there should be academies, not only from a rider or a driver's perspective, but also how do you get into engineering, how do you get into marketing in this sort of a space. So having that sort of a ladder is very, very important. It's slowly coming up, but it really has to be there, and it should really grow exponentially if we want to see India permanently on that map in the long run.
Kind of shocks me when you see the two most populated countries in the world, India and China. They aren't on the calendar as of now. Of course, China is returning next year. But again, as I think everyone, each and every one of us who love the sport, we all dream for the race to be back.
Oh, we absolutely do, and I'm just hoping to see. I when Formula E was announced, I was really hopeful that maybe Formula One would be back on the calendar back in 2025. But that's what it's a lot more than just the whole tax problem. There's, like I
Yeah.
said, it also has to be the demand. You need to have a broadcaster, and there are too many things that have to work well, and it's also down to execution. So probably a few people felt that the Formula E experience could have been better. So that's the thing. It's also how you deliver the event, what follows up after the event, and how long you can stay on the calendar. But I'm really excited to see, and really I'm waiting to see India on the calendar once again, and I'm hoping to be in the paddock one day as a creator whenever that happens.
I'm hoping I get accredited one day, like when the event comes around.
No, you will.
Event comes around with me
You will.
reflex. And yeah, that's always the burning question. We all want to see motorsport back. I'm sure it will take time, and I'm sure that will happen one day. We are growing as a fan base. And another question I had, apart from F1, what other motorsport series do you follow?
Oh, I don't. To be very honest, I don't, because it's only because I don't have the sort of time to invest in following other categories. Uh, like I said, cricket is always going to be my first love when it comes to sports. So I spend a lot of time watching cricket when not following Formula One, uh, and I have a day job as well. This is not something that I do full time. If I'm able to do this full time, then of course I would really like to dive into Formula Two, Formula Three, try to understand the sort of potential drivers that could turn up in Formula One, understand how that series goes. I mean, I do understand how the series is, but follow it a lot more closely, follow a lot of the races. Then there is Formula E. Then there's a lot of other categories also, like IndyCar and Le Mans. There's only so much time for me to create content around Formula One that I can spend in other categories as well. But yeah, I would at one point of time really like to just sit and watch different races through my day and do content around that. That's ultimately the dream.
I mean, in my opinion, I certainly agree because IndyCar and like amazing series. Yeah, they have the two of the biggest races, you know. You have Indy 500, you have the Le Mans. And I just like to narrate one of my experience because this year I watched the Indy 500 for the first time.
Wow.
and my God, I loved it. It was so good, at least
No,
until
it was great.
to watch.
At least until, sorry.
Until about a few laps from the end, I was able to watch,
Okay.
and I loved it.
I
And
first watched the Indy 500. I think when Alonso participated in it in 20. When was it? 2017. Yeah, 2017, and I watched him participating in Le Mans in 2018, and that was the first time I was watching those races as well. And I was like, wow, these races are so different from Formula One, yet so exciting. And I remember coming off those races thinking like I would love to watch these races, but unfortunately there's not enough time, and you don't have the sort of
yes,
means to follow those races as well. It's not easily available, or it's not easily broadcast in India.
to be fair, IndyCar is locked behind a paywall.
Yeah.
Annoying, but I've somehow been able to follow it. YouTube and DIVEBOMB has got a huge IndyCar community because I mean it's a lot of
Wow,
devoted fans. So it's really opened up that sport for me,
that's
and I
great.
can now follow it
That's great.
so easily. And that's kind of what I would say because it's very much possible for you to follow, even if you don't have the means. Try to find a way to follow. I'm sure there are devoted fans. That's kind of what I would say.
Yeah, yeah,
And
definitely.
amid all the stats and facts, did you know Divebomb covered the 24 hours of Le Mans this year on their website?
Wow, I didn't know that.
I was doing live
Sorry, I
updates.
lost you. Sorry, I lost you.
Okay, I was also a part of this team that was covering the 24 hours of Le Mans,
That's
and
great.
covered 6 hours of the 24 hour stint.
Wow. That must have been one experience. That must have been some experience doing it. Was it the first time for you?
Yeah, first time, but it was
That's
somehow,
great.
despite being the first time, I just felt familiar because there's Ferrari, there's Toyota, there's Cadillac, a lot of brands you can recognize.
Yeah, yeah, that's there.
The end, obviously, the inner Ferrari fan in me just went mad.
This year's Le Mans was a good race for you to cover then, because Ferrari won it. So great race to
Absolutely.
start your coverage, at least in Le Mans. But I'm sure you'll be doing a lot more of that.
It's an interesting avenue. That article did pretty well as well.
That's great.
And now I'll just have one final question for you. Like, what are your future plans within motorsport? Do you wish to be covering it more full time, or do you want to limit it to something part time as a side hustle, let me say?
Um, I would definitely love to be F1's official statistician at some point of time, but I too understand that there's quite a bit of work that has to be done to eventually achieve that. I think what I do is pretty unique, and if it's receiving the sort of recognition that's already receiving, then sure there is some value, there's some interest, but I know that I have to do a lot more work in that aspect to have all the numbers on the tip of my fingers. But I'm hoping and I'm sure that will definitely happen at one point of time. But it's also important that I create content to also share my opinions, answer some questions in general, because I feel I have some sort of voice in that area as well. And I think I like storytelling. I like telling a lot of untold stories in Formula One. There's a lot of history about the sport that people don't know. There's a lot of interesting stories that people don't know about. So uh, being an F1 statistician is one thing, but I would also like to be a full-time content creator in this space. If it pays well, then sure, I would want it to be my full-time job, because it also gives me the sort of freedom to do it every single day. And I know I have the passion for creating content and also for Formula One. So yeah, there's a lot of plans that I've set for myself, a lot of targets I've set for myself, which I would obviously want to see the I actually want it to be fruitful at one point of time. But yeah, there are lots of things that I've been planning for multiple platforms, and I'm hoping that it definitely happens.
So, could your future plans revolve around covering further motorsport series if the time permits, of course.
Yeah, primarily I would say Formula 2 and Formula 3 is most important. Then there is also Formula E to a certain extent. I would really love to do MotoGP as well, but then I've, that's also a very difficult category to cover and do stats around. But yeah, I would love, and that's what I'm saying. I just don't want to do stats. I also want to do content that is curated for each type of platform. I also want to do YouTube, I want to do Twitter, and I know there's a lot of general interest in people um, wanting to see behind the scenes stuff at what happens at the circuit, trying to answer the more frequently asked questions and trying to give them a little bit more, trying to give them a perspective what happens during a race week and what are the different things drivers and teams have to do. So there's so many things that can be done, but yeah, it'll take a little bit of time to kind of implement them and get them out.
Right. Thank you so much for all your answers and your time. It was definitely fun chatting with you.
No, thank you for having me. I have to mention that I'm really grateful that
Absolutely.
I was able to speak with you, and it's also great to be speaking generally not only about my career or what my journey has been, just generally about motorsport and sharing my opinions. I'm glad that you reached out and wanted to speak to me. So thank you for
Oh,
having me as well.